The acrid tang of Ares IV's atmosphere filtered through the base's vents, a faint but constant reminder that this planet wasn't meant for fragile, unarmored human lungs. Commander Elias Kane stood at the observation deck, his sharp gaze locked on the endless expanse of the crimson horizon. The twin suns hung low, their fiery glow slicing through the jagged volcanic spires like molten knives. It was a landscape designed to repel, to devour anything foolish enough to linger, and yet it was home. For now. The hum of the outpost machinery vibrated faintly through the reinforced steel beneath his boots, blending with the distant rumbles of volcanic activity. To Kane, it was music, the sound of survival. Yet today, that music carried a dissonance. Something was coming. Something big. "Commander!" A voice called from behind, clipped and precise. Ralvek, the alien strategist, stepped forward, her iridescent skin shimmering faintly under the harsh lighting. Her elongated pupils contracted as she scanned the datapad in her slender hand. The transmission, decoded, partially. The encryption is unlike anything in the Concord database. But one thing is clear. It's a distress signal, and it's heading our way. Kane's jaw tightened. A distress signal doesn't fly straight toward a planet like a missile, Ralvek. What's chasing it? Her pupils widened, betraying a flicker of unease. Unknown, but I doubt it's here to negotiate terms of peace. Doubt is a luxury we don't have, Kane replied, his voice low, cutting through the tension like a blade. Show me the scans. Ralvek extended the pad, her three-fingered hand steady despite the weight of uncertainty hanging between them. Kane studied the readouts. The incoming fleet was massive, its heat signatures an ominous blot against the cold of space. Whatever propulsion it used was highly efficient, almost organic. Tell me I'm not seeing this right, Kane muttered, more to himself than to Ralvek. That can't be one ship. It's not, Ralvek confirmed. It's hundreds, possibly thousands, moving as one. The words hit like a gut punch. Kane's mind raced, calculating options, weighing probabilities. He had faced insurmountable odds before, pirate fleets, rogue Concord factions, even a planetary revolt. But this was different. This felt predatory. Sound the alert, Kane ordered. Get the orbital guns online and double the perimeter patrols. No one rests until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Ralvek hesitated. Commander, our resources are stretched thin, I know, Kane interrupted, his voice sharp but not unkind. That's why we make do. This planet isn't just our outpost, it's our weapon. Let's remind whatever's out there why humans are called Deathworlders. Ralvek inclined her head, the faintest trace of respect in her otherwise unreadable features. As you wish, Commander, but do not forget, arrogance has felled greater empires than yours. Kane smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. And fear has stopped more victories than I can count. Get it done. As Ralvek departed, the door's hydraulic hiss left a heavy silence in its wake. Kane remained rooted to the deck, watching as the planet's boiling geysers erupted in the distance, spewing columns of steam that clawed at the sky. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The control room was a hive of activity, its air thick with the tang of ozone and the sharp scent of burning circuits. Technicians shouted over the static-filled comms as lines of code scrolled across flickering screens. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows, turning the cramped space into a battlefield of its own. Orbital cannons are charging, but the coolant systems are maxed out, a young officer called out. His voice trembled, though he tried to mask it. We can't fire more than 3 rounds without risking a meltdown. Then we make those 3 count, Kane said as he strode into the room, his presence commanding attention. Patch the targeting systems to my console. I'll handle the rest. The officer blinked, then nodded. Yes, sir. Ralvek entered moments later, her expression unreadable but her movements quick and purposeful. Preliminary scans confirm the fleet will be within range in 3 hours. I've also sent drones to gather intel, though I suspect they won't return intact. They don't need to, Kane replied, as long as they send back something useful. Ralvek arched one of her translucent brows. And what if they don't? Then we improvise, Kane said flatly. Ralvek made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a growl. You humans, and your improvisation. One day it will get you killed. Maybe, Kane shot back, his tone as cold as the void. But not today. 3 hours felt like 3 minutes. The outpost bristled with activity as final preparations were made. Turrets whirred to life, their barrels glowing faintly as they cycled through test runs. Ground troops moved in coordinated waves, their boots kicking up the red dust that seemed to cling to everything. The acrid taste of the planet's atmosphere filled the air, mixing with the metallic tang of sweat and fear. Kane stood near the outer defenses, his helmet under one arm. The ground trembled faintly beneath his feet, not from enemy fire, but from Ares 4 itself. The planet was alive, its tectonic fury a constant reminder of the precarious balance they lived on. "Commander," Ralvek said, appearing at his side. She gestured to the horizon where a faint glimmer of light had appeared, an unnatural shimmer against the crimson sky. "They're here." Kane donned his helmet, the HUD flaring to life with a cascade of data. "What's the status on the orbital cannons?" "Charged and ready," Ralvek replied. "But I suggest waiting until the fleet is closer. We'll need every shot to count." Kane nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant lights. They were growing brighter, closer, their shapes beginning to resolve into something more tangible. Ships, massive, organic-looking vessels that seemed to pulse with an eerie, bioluminescent glow. They moved in perfect unison, like a swarm of predators honing in on their prey. "Ralvek," Kane said, his voice low but firm. "If you've got any last-minute objections, now's the time." Ralvek's mandibles clicked faintly, a gesture Kane had come to recognize as reluctant agreement. "None. But if this fails—" "It won't," Kane interrupted. "Failure isn't an option." The Krythos fleet entered the upper atmosphere with a sound like the low growl of a predator circling its kill. The air itself seemed to vibrate with their presence, an oppressive weight that pressed down on the defenders. "All units, hold position," Kane commanded through the comms. His voice was steady, unyielding. "Wait for my signal." The first enemy ship broke through the clouds, its massive form blotting out the light of the twin suns. It was like nothing Kane had ever seen, half machine, half beast, its surface alive with writhing tendrils of energy. "Now," Kane said. The sky lit up as the orbital cannons fired in unison, their beams slicing through the air with a deafening roar. The first ship shuddered under the impact, its bioluminescent glow flickering before it disintegrated in a fiery explosion. Cheers erupted over the comms, but Kane silenced them with a single word. "Focus." More ships descended, their movements unnervingly deliberate. Kane's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sidearm as he watched. This was only the beginning, and he knew, deep in his gut, that the worst was yet to come. The sky blazed with fire and ruin. The first Krythos ship crumbled into an expanding inferno, shards of molten debris raining down like dying stars. But there was no time to celebrate. Behind the destruction, more shadows emerged, vast and unyielding, their bioluminescent tendrils slicing through the smoke like predatory feelers. The Krythos fleet was not deterred. It was enraged. Commander Elias Kane stood motionless on the observation deck, his gaze locked on the unfolding chaos. The orbital cannons recharged, their ominous hum resonating through the outpost like the planet's own heartbeat. The air was thick with tension, the metallic tang of fear mingling with the sulfurous stench of Ares 4's volcanic landscape. Every breath felt heavy, like inhaling the weight of impending doom. "Another wave incoming!" Ralvek's voice cut through the comms, sharp and unwavering. "At least 10 more ships breaching the upper atmosphere." Kane didn't flinch. "How's the perimeter holding?" "Barely," came her clipped reply. "Their drones are overwhelming the outer defenses. We can't sustain this attrition." Kane's jaw tightened. Through the observation window he watched as the next Krythos vessel descended, its exterior shimmering like the carapace of some primordial beast. It moved with unsettling grace, its tendrils snaking outward, seeking weaknesses, probing for prey. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. Send reinforcements to the south flank, Kane ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. Deploy the heavy artillery and keep them moving. They can't adapt to what they can't predict. Ralvik's mandibles clicked softly, a sound Kane had learned to interpret as reluctant agreement. You're gambling with the last of our reserves. It's not gambling if you know the stakes, Kane replied, his tone colder than the void. And right now, the stakes are survival. The outpost trembled as another explosion rocked the ground. Kane staggered but caught himself on the edge of the console. Outside, a distant geyser erupted, spewing molten rock into the sky, the glow reflecting off the approaching ships like the baleful eyes of an apex predator. Commander! A panicked voice crackled through the comms. Drones have breached the eastern perimeter. Sector 7 is compromised. Kane grabbed his rifle and turned to the nearest squad of soldiers. With me. We're sealing Sector 7. The squad snapped to attention, their boots striking the steel floor with synchronized precision. They moved swiftly, the tension palpable, the clatter of gear and weapons a grim symphony of preparation. Kane could feel the heat rising, both from the volcanic terrain and the fear that clung to his men like a second skin. But he couldn't let it show. Not now. The corridor to Sector 7 was dimly lit, the emergency lights casting long, flickering shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. The air smelled of ozone and burnt metal, each breath carrying the bitter sting of destruction. As they approached the breach, the sound of gunfire grew louder, punctuated by guttural, inhuman shrieks. Kane rounded the corner and froze for a heartbeat. The Krythos drones were unlike anything he had imagined. Their bodies were sleek and angular, like shards of living obsidian, with jagged limbs that moved in unnervingly fluid motions. Their glowing cores pulsed rhythmically, casting an eerie green light that turned the corridor into a nightmarish tableau. They were not just machines, they were predators. "Open fire!" Kane bellowed. The squad unleashed a hail of bullets, the deafening roar echoing off the steel walls. Sparks erupted as rounds struck the Krythos drones, some shattering into pieces, others continuing forward with relentless determination. One drone lunged toward Kane, its bladed limbs slicing through the air with lethal precision. He sidestepped and fired point-blank into its core. The drone convulsed and collapsed, its green glow fading to black. "Fall back!" Kane shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to bottleneck them at the junction." The soldiers retreated in controlled bursts, their movements disciplined despite the mounting pressure. Kane covered their flank, his rifle kicking against his shoulder with each shot. The drones pressed forward, undeterred by their losses, their shrieks a chilling counterpoint to the gunfire. When they reached the junction, Kane activated the emergency seal. The steel doors slammed shut, trapping the remaining drones in the corridor. He could hear them clawing at the metal, their screeches a symphony of frustration and malice. "Seal's holding for now," Kane said, his breathing heavy but controlled. He glanced at the squad, their faces pale but resolute. "Good work, all of you. Hold this position. I need to get back to the command center." "Yes, sir," one of them replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Kane turned and sprinted back through the outpost, the sound of his boots echoing in the narrow corridors. He reached the command center just as another alert blared through the comms. "Commander," Ralvik said, her voice unusually tense, "the drones were just the vanguard. We have a larger problem." "I'm listening," Kane replied, stepping up to the central console. Ralvik gestured to the tactical display. The main fleet had begun its descent, and the largest ship, a vessel so massive it dwarfed the outpost, was positioning itself directly above their location. Its exterior was a writhing mass of tendrils, each one pulsating with an otherworldly energy. It was alive, and it was hungry. "That's not a ship," Kane muttered, his stomach knotting. "That's a goddamn Leviathan." Ralvik's expression darkened. "And it's deploying something. Multiple somethings." On the screen, dozens of pods detached from the Leviathan and hurtled toward the surface. Kane watched in grim silence as the first pod landed, its impact shaking the ground. The pod split open, revealing a hulking creature unlike anything he'd seen before. It stood nearly 3 meters tall, its body a grotesque amalgamation of organic and mechanical components. Its glowing eyes scanned the landscape with a predatory intelligence. "They're not just drones," Ralvek said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're soldiers." Kane gritted his teeth. "Get me a comm link to all units. Now." Ralvek complied, and moments later, Kane's voice echoed through the outpost. "This is Commander Kane. The Krythos are deploying ground forces. These aren't mindless machines. They're hunters. But remember, so are we. Use the terrain, use your training, and give them hell." Kane out. He turned to Ralvek. "We can't stop that Leviathan from here. We need to take the fight to them." Ralvek's mandibles twitched. "You're suggesting an assault on that monstrosity?" "I'm not suggesting it," Kane said, his voice hard as steel. "I'm ordering it." For a moment, Ralvek said nothing. Then she inclined her head, her eyes gleaming with something Kane hadn't seen before: respect. "Very well, Commander. Let's see if Deathworlders live up to their reputation." As they began preparing for the assault, Kane allowed himself a single thought. He didn't know if they could win, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: they wouldn't go down without a fight. The battlefield trembled beneath the weight of impending devastation. Kane stood on the observation ridge overlooking the southern flank, where the barren plains of Ares IV sprawled out like an expanse of cracked bone. Dust storms churned at the horizon, their crimson haze mixing with the acrid smoke from smoldering outpost defenses. It was a world on the edge of survival, and today it would either hold its ground or be consumed. The first wave of the Krythos ground forces advanced through the volatile terrain, their monstrous figures cutting through the swirling dust like shadows made flesh. Each step they took was a resounding thud, the ground shivering in reluctant submission. The creatures were as grotesque as they were methodical, biomechanical titans, their exoskeletons a gruesome patchwork of hardened alloy and sinew, their glowing cores pulsating with a rhythm that mimicked a heartbeat. Their sheer mass dwarfed anything the humans or Concord soldiers could field. "Commander!" Ralvek's voice filtered through the comm in a harsh whisper. She stood nearby, her sharp gaze fixed on the advancing enemy. "They're adapting to the terrain. Their movement patterns have shifted. They're avoiding natural choke points and—" "Which means they're learning," Kane cut in, his voice a grim rasp against the crackling static. "But they haven't seen everything this planet has to offer." The volcanic geysers that dotted the plains hissed, their pressure building beneath the surface. Kane keyed into the command network. "All units, prepare to activate Phase 2. Trigger the plasma mines on my mark. Let the ground teach them what they don't know yet." The comms filled with acknowledgments, some steady, others laced with an undercurrent of fear. The Krythos drew closer, their glowing cores casting a sickly green light that painted the ground in an unholy hue. Their methodical advance was unnerving, their unflinching unity a stark contrast to the chaotic, pulse-pounding preparations within the human ranks. A heavy silence descended. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though holding its breath. Kane raised his hand and let it hover for a moment, savoring the tension. Then he brought it down like a hammer. "Mark!" The landscape erupted in blinding waves of light and heat as plasma mines detonated across the enemy's path. Geysers spewed molten streams into the air, forming rivers of fire that surged with merciless intent. The Krythos staggered, their massive frames jerking and convulsing under the assault. Some fell, their cores rupturing in fiery bursts, while others lumbered through the inferno, their exoskeletons blackened but unbroken. The air was a cacophony of explosions, the shriek of searing metal, and the guttural roars of the Krythos as they pressed forward. Kane's earpiece crackled with updates as Concord artillery rained fire on the advancing horde, their shells bursting in thunderous symphony. But it wasn't enough. The Krythos kept coming. "They're still advancing," Ralvek said, her voice tight with urgency. "They're pushing through the flames. Their outer layers are hardening against the heat." Kane slammed a fist against the console beside him. "They're adapting too fast. We need to slow them down." Ralvek's mandibles clicked as she studied the tactical display. "The magnetic field disruptors. We could amplify the output, force them to recalibrate their internal systems." "It'll fry half our own gear," Kane growled. Then we do it manually, Ralvek shot back. Your humans are resourceful, are they not? Kane turned to his squad. The soldiers looked back at him, their faces streaked with sweat and soot, their eyes blazing with determination. He could see it in their stances, the resolve to fight, to endure, no matter the cost. You heard her, Kane said. We go manual. We don't hold anything back. The squad moved without hesitation, hauling portable disruptor units into position while the Krythos drew ever closer. Kane joined them, his hands slick with grime as he adjusted the field generators. The air grew heavy with the hum of charging energy, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to resonate in his bones. Disruptors ready, one soldier called out, his voice straining against the rising tension. Kane nodded. On my count. 1, 2. A Krythos soldier broke through the haze, its massive frame barreling toward their position. Its glowing eyes fixed on Kane, its limbs snapping forward with the precision of a predator about to strike. 3! Kane roared. The disruptors unleashed a burst of magnetic energy that rippled across the battlefield. The air seemed to shatter, the vibrations so intense they sent tremors through Kane's teeth. The Krythos froze mid-charge, their limbs jerking erratically as the disruption scrambled their internal systems. Keep firing, Kane shouted, his voice hoarse from the dust and heat. The soldiers unloaded everything they had, plasma rounds, explosives, even blades when the ammunition ran out. The Krythos fell in heaps of smoldering wreckage, their glowing cores dimming one by one. Ralvek approached, her breathing labored but her posture unbroken. We've bought ourselves time, but it won't last. The Leviathan above is deploying reinforcements. They'll be here within the hour. Kane's mind raced. The battlefield was a furnace, its once solid ground now a churning sea of molten rock and broken bodies. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal and the acrid bite of ozone. His soldiers were exhausted, their faces etched with desperation, but they hadn't broken. Not yet. We can't hold this position forever, Kane said, his voice low, almost to himself. Ralvek tilted her head, her sharp gaze boring into him. Then don't. If we can't hold it, we take the fight to them. Kane turned to her, the faintest flicker of a smirk breaking through his exhaustion. Now you're starting to sound human. She didn't respond, but her mandibles twitched, a gesture he took as reluctant agreement. Through the thickening smoke, Kane could see the looming silhouette of the Leviathan, its massive tendrils stretching downward like the claws of some vengeful god. It was watching, waiting, its presence an oppressive weight that pressed down on everything around it. We take out that ship, Kane said, his voice hardening into resolve. We cripple their command structure. Without it, the rest of their forces will fall apart. Ralvek regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. A bold move, reckless, but perhaps boldness is what we need. Kane activated his comm, his voice cutting through the static like a blade. All units, prepare for extraction. We're taking the fight to the Leviathan. This is our chance to end it. The soldiers erupted into motion, their exhaustion forgotten as the weight of the plan settled over them. Kane watched them, a mixture of pride and trepidation churning in his gut. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. As the extraction ships descended, their engines roaring against the storm, Kane turned his gaze toward the Leviathan. It loomed in the distance, a monument to everything they were fighting against. But it wasn't invincible. Nothing was. We'll show them what Deathworlders can do, Kane muttered under his breath, and with that, he stepped into the fray once more, the promise of victory, or destruction, waiting just ahead. The extraction ships cut through the ashen sky, their engines roaring like defiant war cries against the Leviathan looming above. Kane gripped the edge of the troop carrier's ramp, his eyes locked on the writhing behemoth in the distance. It hung in the air like a harbinger of annihilation, its pulsating tendrils reaching downward, harvesting what remained of the battlefield. The air was a cocktail of burning fuel, sulfur, and the metallic tang of blood, a sensory overload that grounded Kane in the brutal reality of what lay ahead. Ralvek sat across from him, Her lean frame coiled like a spring. Her translucent eyes were sharp, calculating every possibility as the troop carrier rattled through the turbulent winds. Around them, the squad checked their weapons with mechanical precision, their movements tense but steady. The muted clinks and clicks of gear reverberated like a somber rhythm beneath the roar of the engines. "We'll need to disable the tendrils before we can even think about breaching the main hull," Kane said, his voice cutting through the din. He pulled up a holographic projection of the Leviathan on his wrist console, its grotesque form rendered in flickering blue light. "Those things are pulling energy directly from the planet. We sever the connection, and we slow it down. If it can't draw power, it's vulnerable." Ralvik leaned forward, studying the projection. "The tendrils are self-repairing. Severing them won't be enough. We'll need to overload their regenerative systems." "Which is why we're bringing the plasma charges," Kane replied. "We hit the tendrils at multiple points, overload their circuits, and disrupt the flow. That should give us a window to breach the hull and reach the core." One of the soldiers, a burly man with a scar cutting across his brow, frowned. "And if the charges don't work?" Kane met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "Then we improvise. We've done it before. We'll do it again." The soldier nodded, though his grip on his rifle tightened. Kane could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, fear tempered by determination. They all felt it. The Leviathan was unlike anything they had faced before, but fear had no place in the moments ahead. Only action. The carrier jolted as it entered the airspace near the Leviathan. The interior lights flickered, and a deep, resonant hum filled the cabin. Kane's teeth vibrated from the intensity, and he gritted them to keep his focus. "The field generator," Ralvik murmured. "It's emitting some kind of energy distortion. It's disrupting our systems." "Pilot, how much time do we have?" Kane called out. 5 minutes tops before we're fried, sir," the pilot shouted back. "I can't get us any closer without cooking the engines." "Close enough," Kane muttered. He turned to the squad. "Get ready, we're going in hot." The ramp hissed open, revealing the hellscape outside. The wind howled, carrying ash and embers that danced like vengeful spirits. The Leviathan's tendrils moved with eerie precision, their glowing veins crackling with energy as they siphoned the planet's lifeblood. "Go! Go! Go!" Kane shouted. The squad leapt from the carrier, their boots slamming onto the scorched ground. The heat was oppressive, pressing against their armor like a living thing. Kane landed in a crouch, his rifle already trained on the nearest tendril. The ground beneath him trembled, a deep rumble that seemed to echo the Leviathan's heartbeat. Ralvik landed beside him, her movements fluid and controlled. "The tendrils are generating a localized electromagnetic field. We'll need to move fast before our equipment fails." "Noted," Kane said. "Team Alpha, take the eastern tendril. Team Bravo, with me." They moved as one, their training taking over as they navigated the uneven terrain. The tendril loomed ahead, its surface a grotesque blend of organic tissue and alien alloy. It writhed and pulsed, emitting a low, guttural hum that resonated deep in Kane's chest. "Charges in position," one of the soldiers called out as they approached the base of the tendril. Kane knelt beside the soldier, inspecting the placement. The plasma charge glowed faintly, its energy core humming with barely restrained power. He adjusted the alignment, ensuring maximum impact. "Detonator synced," Ralvik reported. "On your mark." Kane raised his hand, sweat streaming down his face despite the cooling system in his helmet. The heat wasn't just external. It was in the air, in his bones, in the crushing weight of the Leviathan's presence. "Now!" he barked. The charges detonated in unison, a blinding cascade of light and heat that sent shockwaves rippling through the ground. The tendril convulsed violently, its glowing veins flickering like a dying heartbeat. For a moment, it seemed to hold, but then it collapsed, its severed length crashing to the ground with a deafening roar. "That's one," Kane said, his voice tight. "Move to the next." As they advanced, the Leviathan retaliated. Smaller tendrils shot down from the main hull, writhing like serpents as they lashed out. One soldier was caught mid-step, the tendril wrapping around his leg and pulling him off the ground. "Hold on," Kane shouted, raising his rifle. He fired a concentrated burst at the tendril, the plasma round slicing through its core. The soldier dropped to the ground, gasping but alive. "They're adapting," Ralvik warned. "The secondary tendrils are targeting us specifically. It's learning our patterns." "Then we change them," Kane replied. He activated his comm. "All units, adjust formation. Keep moving unpredictably. Don't give it time to calculate." They pressed on, taking down another tendril with coordinated precision. The charges detonated, their fiery light casting long shadows that danced across the alien landscape. The Leviathan groaned, a deep, resonant sound that sent a chill down Kane's spine. "We're making progress," Ralvik said, though her tone carried a note of caution. "But we're running out of time." Kane knew she was right. The energy distortion was intensifying, and their equipment was beginning to falter. Sparks flickered from his rifle as he reloaded, and his visor's HUD stuttered with static. They reached the final tendril, its base thicker and more fortified than the others. Kane motioned for his team to hold position as he inspected the structure. The surface was riddled with glowing conduits that pulsed with energy, their rhythm faster than before. "This one's the control node," he realized. "If we take it out, it should disrupt the entire system." Ralvik crouched beside him. "It's also more heavily defended. The energy feedback alone could kill us." "Not if we synchronize the charges and detonate from a distance," Kane said. "We'll need a diversion to draw its attention." Ralvik regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll handle it." Before Kane could protest, she darted forward, her lithe form a blur against the smoky backdrop. The tendrils reacted instantly, lashing out as she fired precise bursts to keep them at bay. She moved with calculated grace, her every step a dance with death. "Charges in position," a soldier called out. Kane set the detonator, his finger hovering over the trigger as he watched Ralvik. The tendrils closed in, their movements frantic and erratic. She fired again, her shots connecting with unerring accuracy. "Ralvik, fall back!" Kane shouted. "Do it now!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. Kane didn't hesitate. He pressed the trigger, and the charges erupted in a brilliant explosion that consumed the tendril. The shockwave knocked him to the ground, the heat searing even through his armor. When the dust settled, the tendril was gone, its base reduced to smoldering rubble. The Leviathan above faltered, its tendrils retracting as its glowing veins dimmed. Kane pushed himself to his feet, his ears ringing, his chest heaving. "Ralvik!" he called out, scanning the battlefield. Through the haze, he saw her emerge, battered but alive. She gave him a sharp nod, her expression unreadable. "We've bought ourselves a window," she said. "Now let's end this." Kane looked up at the Leviathan, its weakened form still looming ominously. The final battle was ahead, and they would face it together. The Leviathan loomed above them, its monstrous form writhing as it struggled to recalibrate from the destruction of its tendrils. The dimming pulses of its veins cast faint shadows across the scorched ground, a flicker of life in a body that was still far from defeated. The air vibrated with its guttural groans, a sound that seemed to claw at the marrow of those who heard it. But to Kane the sound was a herald, not of despair, but of opportunity. He gripped his rifle, its barrel streaked with soot, and turned to his squad. Their faces were streaked with grime and sweat, but their eyes burned with determination. Behind them, Ralvik stood, battered but unbowed, her sharp gaze cutting through the haze. "It's crippled, but not beaten," Kane said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of their survival. "We've taken its legs out, but now we aim for the heart." Ralvik stepped forward, her mandibles twitching with thought. The core is deep within the hull, heavily shielded, heavily guarded, and judging by the scale of the creature, it will not be a simple thing to destroy. "Nothing simple about any of this," Kane replied, his lips curling into a grim smile. "But we didn't come this far just to play it safe. We hit the core, we end this." A low rumble rolled through the ground, and the Leviathan seemed to react, its tendrils retracting as if to protect itself. The air thickened, charged with static, and Kane's visor flickered again. The energy field was strengthening. Time was slipping away. "Extraction ships are standing by, Commander," a soldier reported, his voice strained but resolute. "They'll pull out the wounded. We're all that's left." Kane nodded. "That's all we need. Let's move." The squad advanced, each step deliberate, their boots crunching over the cracked ground. The Leviathan loomed closer, its hull a grotesque amalgamation of living tissue and impenetrable alloy. Veins of energy pulsed across its surface, an unnerving rhythm that felt almost sentient. The closer they drew, the more oppressive its presence became, like standing beneath the weight of a falling sky. Ralvek held up a hand, signaling a halt. "There's a breach point. There," she said, pointing to a jagged tear in the Leviathan's side. "From the last orbital strike. It's narrow, but it will get us inside." Kane eyed the opening. It was barely wide enough for one person to slip through at a time, and the edges glowed faintly with residual energy. A trap, perhaps, or simply the natural state of something that shouldn't exist. "Perfect," he said, his voice tinged with irony. "Ralvek, you're with me. Everyone else, hold position and cover us. If we don't make it back—" "You'll make it back," one soldier interrupted, his voice firm. "You always do." Kane met the man's gaze, then nodded. "Then let's not keep them waiting." The two slipped through the breach, their armor scraping against the jagged edges. Inside, the Leviathan was a labyrinth of pulsating corridors, its walls alive with a sickly green glow. The air was damp and acrid, thick with the scent of decay and ozone. Kane's boots squelched against the organic floor, and he suppressed a shudder. Every step felt like walking through the belly of a living nightmare. "Stay sharp," Kane muttered. "This thing isn't going to let us stroll to the core." As if in answer, the corridor ahead came alive. Tendrils burst from the walls, snapping toward them with lethal intent. Kane fired instinctively, his plasma rounds searing through the organic limbs. Ralvek moved with fluid precision, her rifle cutting down the rest. "It's learning," Ralvek said, her voice low but taut. "Adapting faster." "Then we adapt faster," Kane shot back. "Keep moving." They pushed deeper into the Leviathan, the walls growing narrower, the air heavier with every step. The sounds of the creature's groans and the crackling of energy grew louder, oppressive. Kane's heart pounded in rhythm with the vibrations underfoot, each beat a reminder of how close they were and how much farther they had to go. Finally, they reached the core chamber. It was massive, a cathedral of alien architecture. The core itself hung in the center, a pulsing, radiant sphere encased in a lattice of glowing tendrils. The energy it emitted was almost blinding, a cascade of light that refracted off the walls in chaotic patterns. Kane stared at it, his breath catching for just a moment. It was both beautiful and terrible, a creation that defied every law of nature he had ever known, and it was their target. "Plasma charges won't penetrate that lattice," Ralvek said, her voice cutting through the awe. "We need a direct hit on the core." Kane nodded. "Set the charges anyway. I'll clear the path." Ralvek hesitated, her translucent eyes narrowing. "You'll be exposed." "Not for long," Kane replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ralvek's mandibles twitched, but she said nothing. She moved to set the charges, her movements precise and efficient. Kane took a deep breath, then stepped forward, his rifle raised. The tendrils reacted immediately, snapping toward him with terrifying speed. Kane moved like a predator, weaving through their attacks, his rifle spitting plasma with unerring accuracy. Each shot severed a tendril, but more replaced them, faster and more aggressive. One grazed his shoulder, sending a jolt of searing pain through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. "Charges set," Ralvek called out. "Get clear," Kane shouted. Ralvek didn't argue. She darted back, her form a blur against the chaos. Kane focused on the core, its radiant glow growing more intense as he drew closer. The heat was unbearable, the light blinding, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He reached the lattice and planted the final charge directly against the core. The tendrils surged toward him, a writhing storm of fury. Kane turned, his hand on the detonator. "Ralvek," he said over the comm, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Get out of here." Her voice crackled through the static. "What about you?" Kane looked back at the core, the light filling his vision. Someone has to make sure it goes off. There was silence on the other end, then a single word. Understood. Kane smiled faintly. It's been an honor. He pressed the detonator. The explosion was blinding, a cascade of light and heat that consumed the core in an instant. The shockwave tore through the chamber, shattering the tendrils and ripping through the Leviathan's body. Kane felt the force slam into him, and then there was nothing but light. When Kane opened his eyes, he was lying on the ground outside the Leviathan. The air was filled with the acrid tang of burning flesh and metal, but the monstrous creature was gone. All that remained was a smoldering crater, its edges glowing faintly in the dying light of the twin suns. Ralvik stood over him, her expression unreadable. "You're alive," she said, her tone more a statement than a question. "Barely," Kane replied, his voice hoarse. He tried to sit up, wincing as pain lanced through his body. "Did we win?" Ralvik extended a hand, pulling him to his feet. "The Leviathan is gone. The fleet is retreating. It seems your gamble paid off." Kane looked out over the battlefield. His soldiers were gathering, their faces marked with exhaustion, but also something else. Triumph. They had done the impossible. They had survived. "That's what Deathworlders do," Kane said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We adapt. We endure." Ralvik regarded him for a long moment, then nodded. "Perhaps you are more than just survivors." As the twin suns dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, Kane looked to the stars. The battle was over, but the war was far from finished, and humanity would be ready. Because in the end, it wasn't fear or despair that defined them. It was their unrelenting will to fight, to adapt, to rise. And that, Kane thought, was something no Leviathan could ever destroy.